This meeting or this defense will also be recorded. So just make sure you watch your language or phrases, you know, in the event that something inappropriate might pop up. So I think that's all of the housekeeping stuff on my end. And so without any further spieling on my part, I will kick it over to Brandon, and he's going to talk to us about his thesis.
Okay, thanks for that, Matt. So, okay, we conducted a field study examining heart rate demands during recreational snowboarding. Snowboarding as a sport hasn't really been around very long, 30 years give or take. During the 1984 and 85 ski seasons, only 40 resorts allowed snowboarding. And within 4 seasons, that number grew to 476. However, not only is the sport relatively young, but ski resorts are not easily accessible. And until recently, technology was limited that allowed for easy data collection, and there is no data currently available regarding the heart rate demands during snowboarding. Studies have been done adjacent to snowboarding, including one study that examined injury patterns in young skiers and snowboarders who were under the age of 15. They found that intensive care and mortality rates were similar, which was 0.03% with a p-value greater than 0.99. And snowboarders were more likely to sustain upper extremity and abdominal injuries, while skiers were more likely to sustain lower extremity, facial, and thoracic injuries. However, in 1998, the director of athlete preparation for the U.S. ski and snowboard team suggested that incidents may occur as a result of poor strength conditioning. In a study examining 3 elite snowboarders who achieved 92% of their heart rate max during a halfpipe competition, KIPP recommended reducing injuries via targeted strength programming, such as neck strengthening or anterior-posterior asymmetries. There have also been anthropometric studies examining snowboarders and performance superiority. In a physiological and physical preliminary review regarding aerobic fitness, they showed that VO2 max was unrelated to snowboarders' performance superiority. They did, however, find that power output as isometric quadricep force production was a better predictor of performance and was strongly correlated in an Austrian snowboarding team. A strong correlation was also found between leg stiffness and the capacity to maintain muscle force. However, contrary to what the authors expected, explosive strength was not a strong correlate of snowboarding performance. And the author defined performance superiority as snowboarders' national or international standing, professional standing, in regards to the sport or in relation to how often they won events in their snowboarding categories. However, there are variables in environmentally dynamic sports, such as altitude, that may affect individuals' physiology. Winter sports often take place at high altitudes, and hypoxic exercise at altitudes greater than 2,300 meters may elicit a decrease of heart rate max by up to 5 beats per minute. And this would increase relative exercise intensity as arterial oxygen saturation decreases. But to complicate the mechanisms of cardiac output further, the resting or baseline heart rate may also increase 45 beats per minute at altitudes above 1,650 meters. So these two factors may create a situation where athletes performing at higher altitudes have an increased resting heart rate, but with a lower threshold for exercise intensity. Previous research has not examined how much time is spent in heart rate zones during snowboarding, or if snowboarding could reduce morbidity and mortality risk factors if it was classified as cardiovascular exercise, as per the guidelines set forth by the American College of Sports Medicine and the Center for Disease Control. Therefore, the purpose of this study was to investigate the heart rate demands of recreational snowboarding in adults, and we hypothesized that heart rates achieved during snowboarding would meet the ACSM cardiovascular fitness guidelines for moderate to vigorous intensity exercise. All right. For the purposes of this defense, there were two terms commonly used to describe a specific duration of snowboarding and a term for the entire snowboarding duration. The term run was defined as any downhill descent, and session was defined as the duration individuals recorded data on and around the ski resort. We recruited 25 participants, 2 of which were not included in the data sets because parts of the data were missing. But participants were between the ages of 18 to 55 with an average age of 28 who had consecutive for a minimum of 20 days non-consecutively over their lifetime. The participants were provided an explanation and an informed consent, which they returned. And on average, participants felt comfortable snowboarding at a difficulty level between black and double black. And the average duration of the session was 6 hours and 4 minutes. And that would be the time that they started recording, irregardless of where they were or their activity state. In order to gather participant characteristics, individuals were asked to fill out a questionnaire, and for participant anonymity, the questionnaire was serialized with their Polar V800 GPS wristwatch and H7 heart rate strap. The watches were set to record at high accuracy mode at 1 second intervals, and participants were encouraged to snowboard as they usually would. The variables that were recorded included time, GPS location, altitude, speed, and heart rate. When participants concluded their sessions, devices were returned and data was uploaded to the Polar Cloud via Polar Sync software. The video clip in this slide is a digital recreation of an individual's heart rate tracked over one snowboarding session. In order to determine snowboarding's efficacy as cardiovascular exercise, heart rates were defined by the ACSM recommendation. These recommendations include 3 categories, which define light intensity as heart rates below 64% of heart rate max. Moderate intensity was defined as percent of max heart rates between 64 and 76, and recommended equal to or in excess of 150 weeks per minute, or the vigorous category, any percent of heart rate max above 76. And this would require equal to or in excess of 75 minutes per week to achieve the cardiovascular benefits of exercise. Activity states were separated into snowboarding versus non-snowboarding. Snowboarding was defined as time points when participants' altitude was decreasing at a rate of at least 1 meter per second, and when distance was increasing at a rate of at least 1 meter per minute. And in the next slide, I'll show why it was necessary to use distance and altitude to be more discriminate. The graph on the top is the slope deviation of altitude. On the x-axis is time in seconds times 10,000, and on the y-axis is the slope deviation compared to baseline. And when the slope deviation was increasing or unchanging, a data point was defined as non-snowboarding. All other data points in relation to altitude were defined as snowboarding, the non-snowboarding being highlighted in red and the snowboarding in green. Similarly, the graph on the bottom, the x-axis is time, seconds times 1000, and the y-axis is slope deviation of cumulative distance, where any data point that was a slope which was unchanging because you couldn't have a decreasing based on cumulative, the changing data point would be considered non-snowboarding, and all other data points would be defined as snowboarding in green. MATLAB was used to differentiate activity states and to calculate means, standard deviations, or heart rate maximum, and time spent in activity states. Also, participants' snowboard duration were not controlled, and therefore time was standardized by converting each participant's heart rate zone duration to a percentage of that participant's session duration, and then those percentages were averaged and converted back into time in minutes. T-tests and a two-way ANOVA were used to determine if time spent in heart rate zones were significantly different within activity states or compared between activity states. And those were had a p-value set at 0.05. In this graph, on the x-axis is time in seconds. On the primary y-axis, you have the change in altitude in meters, and the altitude change is in green. On the secondary axis is the snowboarding condition, 0 being non-snowboarding and 1 being snowboarding. When the snowboarding condition is overlaid with altitude, you can see that the altitude is not discriminant enough, here where the blue arrows are, to determine where there were plateaus during a run. However, when snowboarding condition based on distance slope is added, those changes are in gray, and you can see where the distance is slightly more discriminant than the altitude change. And so when you combine the two, you get a more resolute differentiation between activity states. And it was necessary to include the altitude because there were times when distance was increasing, but that might have been walking to a lift or what have you. And so it was necessary to require both of those. These are representations of altitude and heart rate changes during a typical snowboarding session, with time on the x-axis and change in heart rate as beats per minute on the primary axis and altitude in meters on the secondary axis. The left graph is data collected at Big Bear Ski Resort, and the data on the right was collected at Mammoth Lakes Ski Resort. In some parts of these graphs, you can see where altitude was increasing, and that would be specific to when participants were riding a ski lift. And in general, those heart rates were typically lower, but these graphs aren't really specific to showing that well. So this is a better indication of what the snowboarding heart rates were during snowboarding. On the x-axis, you have heart rates out of heart rate max. The heart rate max was 188 beats per minute. On the axis, you have the activity state and the session snowboarding, the session average. The average snowboarding heart rate was 142 beats per minute out of 188, which was equal to 76% of individuals' heart rate max. The non-snowboarding category was 117 beats per minute out of 188, or 62% of participants' heart rate max. And then the average session duration was 121 beats per minute, or 64% max. And you can see that the session heart rate is more closely aligned to the non-snowboarding heart rate max, and that will be more obvious when the time is broken up by activity state because most of participants' snowboarding session was spent not snowboarding. So when participant session duration is broken up into snowboarding and non-snowboarding, the time spent in heart rate zones per the ACSM guidelines show that snowboarders spend an average of 53% of a session in light intensity, 26% of a session in moderate intensity, and 21% of a session was spent in vigorous intensity heart rate zones. However, 4% of a session was spent snowboarding in the moderate intensity, and 7% of a session was spent snowboarding in the vigorous heart rate zone. The time in minutes was calculated from the total session duration as the average percent individuals spent in heart rate zones, which was the basis for meeting the ACSM guidelines. The average session duration was 343 minutes, which on average was spent at 64.4% of max heart rate across participants, which is within the ACSM recommendation guidelines for moderate intensity. However, the majority of a snowboard session was not spent snowboarding, which accounted for 85%. The not snowboarding did. And the remainder of average sessions were spent snowboarding in the active state at 76% of max heart rate. And this intensity would achieve the ACSM minimum standard for vigorous intensity based on activity state. The intensity achieved during snowboarding would achieve the minimum 20 minutes of vigorous activity that the ACSM recommends as a daily exercise prescription in a 143-minute snowboard session. The heart rates elicited during snowboarding are similar to other environmentally dynamic sports, such as surfing, indoor recreational rock climbing, and slalom downhill skiing. In comparison, wave riding and paddling and surfing were 142 and 145 beats per minute compared to snowboarding heart rate, which was 142 beats per minute. However, in comparison, surfers only 40% of a surf session was spent stationary, compared to snowboarding, where 85% of a session was spent not sedentary, but not active. There are also similarities between snowboarding and indoor recreational rock climbing, where average percent of heart rate max was 64.4% to 64.9% in a rock climbing session. And even between activity states, the active climbing was only 1% higher and 1.4% lower during non-activity. However, when comparing max heart rate, snowboarders achieved 102% of their age predicted max heart rate compared to surfing at 90% and indoor recreational rock climbing at 77%. But there were super maximal heart rates achieved in a downhill skiing study, where young skiers achieved 104% of their max heart rate compared to a percent max heart rate of 102 during a lab-based VO2 max test. But there are variables that can affect percent heart rate max, including altitude. And although submaximal oxygen uptake is similar between sea level and exercise at altitude, a reduction in intensity must occur to maintain a desired difficulty. But maintaining a desired difficulty in hypoxic environments can be difficult. And in order to determine if a change in percent max heart rate could have been influenced by altitude, an equation can be used to normalize the change and determine if an effect exists. The altitude at which snowboarding occurred accounted for an average decrease of heart rate max of 7.2 beats per minute. And this would be equal to an increase of 3.9% heart rate max or intensity. However, the increased intensity adjustment was not significantly different from the measured heart rate data. And therefore, it's likely that changes in altitude during snowboarding did not influence intensity as heart rate max. But that doesn't mean that the lack of significance, it doesn't mean that that implies that altitude didn't have an impact on heart rate or heart rate max, only that heart rate changes were independent of altitude changes during snowboarding in this population. In closing the discussion, it might be advantageous to compare time spent in heart rate zones as a measure of heart rate demands versus time spent in activity zones. Snowboarding accounted for 14% of the session, which elicited heart rates above 76% of heart rate max, and would be considered vigorous intensity exercise, where that 143-minute snowboard session would meet the ACSM guidelines for cardiovascular exercise. However, time spent in moderate and vigorous heart rate zones across an entire session accounted for 46% of individual sessions, by which a 64-minute snowboard session would elicit 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So the data shows snowboarding is a viable mode of exercise, which would serve to reduce morbidity and mortality risk factors. And although snowboarding accounts for a small percentage of a session, the average intensity is relatively high, even during non-snowboarding. And so snowboarders, at least in this study, should be cognizant that time spent not snowboarding may not necessarily be considered recovery. This was a field study and was subject to some limitations. The sample size was small, and in addition, garments worn between participants were not controlled, and environmental conditions such as wind or precipitation or temperature could have influenced participants' heart rates. Also, we were not able to monitor each participant individually or visually confirm their activity state. And so data points which define activity states may have a degree of inaccuracy. Lastly, participants were mostly recruited from a university community via convenient sampling and word of mouth. And so data from this study should not be extrapolated to a broader snowboarding population. In conclusion, recreational snowboarding in adults elicits intensities which meet the ACSM guidelines for cardiovascular exercise and can be used in exercise protocols to reduce risk factors associated with morbidity and mortality. I would like to thank my mentor, Matt, Dr. Schubert, for his willingness to guide me through this process and all the invaluable contributions he's made, not only for the thesis, but for the program, and as well as the remainder of my committee, Dr. Sean Newcomer and Dr. Richard Armenta, without whom I would not have completed this. There's a pervasive theme throughout the project. I'd come and say, hey, like, what about this? What about this? And they'd say, yeah, just less is more. So thank you for that. Also a huge shout out to the faculty, CSUSM Kinesiology Department, and especially my peers who helped and or may have participated. So.
All right, thank you, Brandon. Good job. At this point in time, we will now open up for questions from the audience. You can either unmute yourself and ask your question. I ask that you introduce yourself if you do that. Otherwise, you can type it into the chat and I will ask Brandon that question.
Hi, Brandon. This is Ron Dunn. I wanted to commend you on the analysis of the data for such a highly variable type of activity. This seems like a really good contribution to be able to assess normal function out in the world, whereas we usually have just the kind of the data calibrated in the lab. So I wanted to congratulate you on that. And maybe if it's possible, I'd like to talk to you at some point about the details.
Absolutely.
One last note, Big Bear were the snowboarders at Snow Summit or Bear Mountain? is not critical. It's just a point of interest.
I can get that information to you. I'm not exactly certain right offhand. I want to say Bear Mountain, but we had a lot of different people at a lot of different mountains, and so to say one or the other would be doing a disservice. So I'll get that information to you.
That's fine. If we get a chance to talk about the analysis, we can share that location information also. But again, congratulations. It's a real difficulty trying to assess actual behavior because it's so much more complex than what you see in the lab. So good job. Thanks for putting it together.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you, Ron. Any other questions for Brandon? Don't be shy.
Hey, Brandon, it's Natalie. I have a quick question. Hope you don't mind. So I'm curious, were these, I guess because some of this data was collected at Big Bear, were they going off jumps or anything of that nature? And if so, do you think that this would have impacted their heart rates during these activity zones?
They definitely, I don't remember specifically at Big Bear, but I do know that there were people that were in the park at Mammoth Lakes, and I'm certain that it did influence their heart rate zones and the time spent in them. But when we designed the study, we wanted to categorize the recreational population, and because a lot of recreationalists are not free riders, but they mix it between alpine and downhill and backwoods, and so we wanted to get as much information about a broader population as we could, and so we didn't restrict their specific style, and so we categorized heart rates as a function of all recreational snowboarding as opposed to snowboarding styles, I suppose.
Perfect. Yeah, no, that's awesome. Thanks.
More questions? We still have some time.
Hi, Brandon.
Maybe.
So, did you consider measuring the waiting lines on the lifts? Do you think that could have affect the data about those 48 minutes, right? Because I personally think that is like a low number.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry, I wasn't able to hear you very well.
So, did you consider measuring the waiting lines on the lifts? Do you think that could have effect based on if it's crowded or it's not crowded, the riding times?
Oh, absolutely. So we absolutely think that it did influence individuals' intensities, but because of the nature of snowboarding, especially at resorts like Big Sky at Montana or at Mammoth Lakes, you're talking about a massive area of coverage, and it just wasn't feasible to be able to be with snowboarders, and it would also create a little bit of bias, I suppose, to have people following recreationalists around, because we wanted what their expenditure would be without the influence of the study. We wanted just a snapshot of what it looked like not in a lab. And so I'm sure that there was a lot of waiting time, and that is something that we could tease apart in the data. We haven't done it yet. There's some analysis that we've discussed further down the road in terms of publication later, but it probably lends to the fact that so much time was spent in the non-active state, because the amount of time spent snowboarding was drastically less than the time spent at rest, and it was less than we even expected going into this. And so when you think about how much energy you expend on a slope, one day is exhausting, but then you look at the data and you're waiting in lines for potentially 30 minutes at a time. And then a lot of people spend hours at lunch. And so we were unable to define those separate activity states, right? So like in the surfing study, they were able to differentiate paddling versus wave riding versus stationary versus miscellaneous. And that just wasn't feasible for us in this environment. So it would have been something nice to examine, but it's unfortunately just not something that we could work into the study design.
Yeah, I know the ski resorts, they have normally some kind of tracking app. They detect you when you are next to lifts or on the lift based on your location. However, I don't know if you can combine both data or even if that data is reliable enough.
Right. It might also be difficult to get access from the ski resort to use that information without like direct access to the server, unless you had the participants write down each amount of time that they expected, and even then it would be an approximation, I assume. So, but it would be something you should look at.
That makes sense. Only one last question.
Yeah,
Do you know if the data was over the weekends or during the week, or?
It was a little bit of both. Most of the participants went during long weekends or during holidays. And so during times which were like Christmas or spring break, there was a lot of weekly snowboarding. But over weekend trips, it usually takes 6 hours to drive to Mammoth. And so most people would snowboard Saturday, Sunday, and come back. We didn't differentiate by week, but it was an amalgamation. And that was another thing. That was one of those things that we didn't want to limit. We didn't want to tell the participants any biasing factors. And so we said, look, if you're going snowboarding, let us come. Like if you just let us collect the data, you do your thing, and we just want to see what happens during snowboarding.
All right. Thanks, Brandon. Good job.
I actually have a kind of a small question to follow up with that. This is Natalie again. Sorry, Brandon. So this is the last one. Are there activity profiles set for skiers? And if so, do you think that would be a comparable, I don't know, activity, I guess, since doing essentially, I mean, minus like if they're doing like a lot of different like jumps or whatever, but like my question, I guess, to you is, are there activity profiles for skiers at this time?
Like whether it meets the cardiovascular exercise or like how much time they spend?
Yeah, percentage of time spent during, you know, like going on a lift or like eating, like, or in lodges and like downhill, or just like very general categories.
I haven't seen studies that do that. There was a study published in 2017 where they controlled for 2 speeds, and then they did a freestyle speed. But most of skiing studies have been done mostly in like downhill slalom racing, or the cross-country skiing is a huge market because of the cardiovascular benefit and the amount of intensity that it requires. And so there really haven't been a lot of downhill or recreational skiing studies done compared to cross-country skiing, or really just in general. So
yeah, just curious because I figured, you know, skiing, I guess technically has been around a little bit longer, so I didn't know if there might have been more studies on that, but thanks for clarifying. Good job, by the way.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, when we first started the study design, we considered including skiers, or actually, I guess we considered including skiers after the original study design. We started recruiting participants snowboarding, and we didn't find a lot. And so we went back and like, well, should we include skiers? And we went back and forth and ultimately decided not to. But since there's not data similar to this, and whether it meets guidelines, that would have been interesting to look at.
All right, Brandon. Matt Becker had a question. So he says, it sounds like the snowboarding sessions meet the ACSM requirements for exercise just based on heart rate. But if they were riding a ski lift and had heart rates in moderate or high intensity zones, is that really exercise? How did or how could we confirm that increased heart rate was due only to exercise and not other factors like altitude or excitement?
Well, so the altitude was examined, I guess, across the session, and so that variable, the altitude, was removed as a cofactor in increasing heart rates relative to the snowboarding session. It could be that altitude played a larger role in baseline heart rate, just being at altitude, not specific to an activity state. But when it was separated by activity, when snowboarders were descending in altitude and increasing in distance, we quantified that time spent as snowboarding, and the heart rates that were achieved during snowboarding were significantly different from heart rates achieved during non-snowboarding, in addition to time spent in activity zones. Does that answer your question, Matt?
He says yes. All right, we can take one more question from the audience if anybody has one. Otherwise, are there any more questions at this time? Looks like no. All right, then. Then thank you for coming to Brandon's thesis defense. I'd ask that the audience members exit or leave at this time so that the committee can meet with Brandon privately.
Good job once again.
Thank you very much.
Brandon, you got some congrats in the chat too.
Nice.
And that's everybody except Jeff. All right, so I'm going to stop recording this.